What if I told you that in the frozen heart of Montana, a lone battle-scarred dog stood between a helpless bear cub and certain death, and what followed would defy every law of nature? This is not just survival, it's a story of instinct, sacrifice, and an unbreakable bond born in the snow. Like, subscribe, and stay with us, because in the next few minutes, your understanding of love, loyalty, and wild miracles will never be the same. The wind howled low over the snow-draped peaks of Glacier National Park, Montana, sweeping through the thick pine forests like a mournful song. It was late February, and the world lay frozen in a hush of white silence. The moon hung low and bruised behind thin clouds, casting a faint silver sheen on the blanket of snow that coated the valley floor. In the shadows of a steep ridge, beneath an overhanging cluster of bare pine boughs, lay a cave half hidden by fallen branches and ice. Inside it, curled against the bitter cold, was a German shepherd named Shadow. Shadow was no ordinary wild dog. He had once belonged to a unit of the military K-9 Corps, trained for search and rescue and detection missions. Standing nearly 28 inches at the shoulder, with a coat of dark sable fur and faint tan markings across his chest and forelegs, he moved like a soldier even now, his posture disciplined, his ears constantly alert. But his eyes, once sharp and full of obedience, now held the dulled glint of loss. A jagged scar cut across his right flank, a souvenir from a mission gone wrong in a collapsed warehouse overseas. The injury had slowed him down, made him unfit, and so they left him behind when the unit returned. Abandoned, confused, and betrayed, he'd escaped the shelter truck on a stormy highway night and disappeared into the wilderness. That had been almost 2 winters ago. Since then, he'd learned to survive on instinct and memory. The forest was now his world. He hunted alone, moved like a ghost between thickets, and rarely approached trails or campsites. Shadow had grown leaner, tougher, and colder with time. But though solitude had made him strong, it had also carved hollows in him that neither food nor sleep could fill. That night, as snowflakes began to fall like ash from the clouds, Shadow stirred from his cave. His nose twitched. Beneath the usual sense of pine sap and frozen earth, something new cut through the air, a faint sound. It wasn't the rustle of prey, nor the wind's whistle. It was thinner. Broken. A soft, rhythmic cry. Something was out there. Something very young. His body stiffened. Ears perked, he padded quietly toward the tree-line, each paw step careful and silent. The sound came from the eastern slope, where a recent landslide had exposed bare rock and shattered trees. That was cougar territory, but this sound didn't belong to any predator. It was the unmistakable whimper of a baby, no, not human. But almost. It trembled on the air like a thread of music barely played. As he crept closer, the wind shifted. He caught the scent. It was damp, warm, faintly musky, wild, but not canine. A moment later, Shadow rounded a cluster of snow-covered boulders and saw it. There, curled into a half-frozen hollow beneath a splintered log, was a bear cub. No more than 2 months old, its fur was a soft brown-black with flecks of lighter tan on the ears. It was barely breathing, sides heaving in shallow gasps, eyes squeezed shut from cold or fear, or both. It let out a plaintive squeak, weak and lost. Shadow froze. Everything in him said turn away. This was not his kind. It wasn't his responsibility. But then the cub whimpered again, and something in that sound punched straight into the core of him. It was the same sound his partner had made, Sergeant Kevin Hartley, a man of quiet command and kind eyes, on that final mission, pinned beneath debris, calling to Shadow to go get help. Shadow had obeyed. But by the time help came, it had been too late. The memory burned behind his eyes. The wind stung his face. The cub whimpered again. Shadow stepped forward. He sniffed the air again, checking for signs of the mother. But there was nothing. No tracks in the snow. No broken twigs. No distant scent of another bear. The cub was truly alone. He moved closer, slowly, lowering his massive head to meet the cub's trembling form. It flinched as his breath touched its fur but didn't move. Shadow gave a quiet, low rumble, a sound he used in the field to signal calm. The cub didn't respond, only let out another faint squeak. Shadow looked around. No one was coming. No mother. No human. Just wind, snow, and the dark arms of the mountain. Then, without truly deciding, Shadow gently gripped the cub's scruff with his jaws, just as he'd been trained to do with wounded soldiers, and lifted it. It weighed next to nothing. He turned, padded back toward the cave. The forest watched in silence. The cave was colder than Shadow remembered, its stone walls pulsing with drafts that whispered through unseen cracks. The wind outside had picked up, brushing flurries of snow against the pine-strewn entrance like a curtain of icy feathers. Inside, the air was thick with the musky scent of damp fur and dried pine needles. Shadow placed the cub gently in the farthest corner of the den, where the earth was slightly warmer and moss had gathered into a sort of crude nest. The little bear stirred but didn't wake, its body curled tight, small paws tucked beneath its chin. Its fur, now a mix of frost and dirt, rose and fell in shallow rhythm. Shadow lay down opposite the cub, eyes wide open, every muscle alert. His instincts battled each other like warring packs in his chest. He was a predator, yes, but also a guardian by training, one bred for discipline, command, and protection. In his working days, he had once cradled a human infant pulled from a bombed village, carrying her 3 miles back to camp under gunfire. His handler, Kevin, had called him, the wolf with a warrior's heart. Now the silence around him was deeper than gunfire ever had been. The cub whimpered in its sleep. A faint, dry rasp of hunger. Shadow's ears flicked. There was no milk here. No heat lamp, no bottle, no gentle human hands with soft towels. Only snow, and instinct. Shadow stood and padded outside into the cold again, nose to the wind. He moved downhill, his movements stealthy and fluid. Beneath the thick boughs of a fallen spruce, he found what he needed, a rabbit nest, abandoned but still lined with soft fur. He tore off some of the warm-flaced bedding with his teeth and carried it back to the den. Laying the material gently next to the cub, he nosed it closer. The bear stirred, its snout twitching as it inhaled the faint scent of mammal warmth. It didn't wake, but its shivering slowed. That night, Shadow stood guard without sleep. The morning came like the breath of a sleeping giant, slow, white, and heavy. Sunlight filtered through the pines but brought no warmth. Shadow left early, moving with careful urgency across familiar hunting trails. By noon, he had taken down a hare. He didn't eat. Returning to the cave, he chewed the meat until it was nearly paste, then pressed it close to the cub's mouth. The cub woke slowly, blinking in confusion. Shadow nudged the warm meat gently against its lips. At first, the cub turned away. Then, drawn by instinct stronger than confusion, it licked. It wasn't milk. But it was enough. A mile away, a woman paused mid-step, her boots crunching softly in the frost. She was tall, over 5'9", with sun-weathered skin and a lean, wiry build. A pale knit cap was pulled down low over short-cropped gray hair. Her name was Mara Ellison, 61, a former park ranger turned wildlife tracker. Her sharp hazel eyes scanned the snow for tracks invisible to most. She'd been a fixture in the area for nearly 2 decades, known for her solitary nature and refusal to use drones or trail cams. Locals respected her, but she preferred the company of mountains to people. After the loss of her partner to cancer 5 years ago, Mara had withdrawn even more, burying her grief in the rhythm of the wild. Now, she crouched down beside a faint line of paw prints, large, precise, and deliberate. She traced a gloved hand along the snow. "A German shepherd," she murmured. "That same dog again." She had spotted glimpses of the creature before, once from her truck, another time while setting motion sensors for research. A dog, alone and unclaimed, roaming deep into grisly territory with no collar, no tags. And now, fresh beside the tracks, something else, tiny pawprints. Rounder. Heavier spacing. Her breath caught. A cub, she whispered. Back at the cave, Shadow was cleaning the cub with rough but careful licks. The cub had begun to move more. Its legs were still weak, but its eyes no longer dulled by frost. When it squeaked, Shadow responded with a low, melodic rumble. They had no language. But they had presence. And that was enough for now. Later that evening, Shadow ventured further from the cave, leaving the cub safe behind a barrier of gathered branches. He followed a scent trail down the mountain, a female deer, limping. He stalked it with silent patience, channeling old training. When he returned with a flank of fresh meat, the cub sniffed at it with more interest than before. That night, the cub, unnamed still, crawled close to Shadow's flank. The dog didn't move, but his tail gave a faint flick. Outside, the stars blinked through the branches. A new routine was forming. 3 days passed. Then 5. On the 6th morning, while scouting, Shadow caught a new scent, a recent trail, human. But it wasn't the sharp reek of sweat and cigarette ash like careless hikers. This scent was pine oil, canvas, and something familiar, animal musk. Shadow froze. He knew this scent. Ranger. A figure emerged through the trees half a mile off, bent over the snow. Mara. Shadow backed behind a thick tree and watched. She examined the tracks again, following the double trail, the cub's and his. She did not call out. Instead, she reached into her satchel and placed a strip of dried salmon on a flat rock, then turned and walked away. Shadow didn't approach. But he memorized the gesture. Back in the cave, the cub sneezed softly as he returned. Shadow touched noses with it briefly, then curled around it once more. The bond was growing. The snow began to soften as March tiptoed into the valley, though Glacier National Park still wore its winter coat. Thin beams of sun pierced the trees more often now, revealing patches of dark earth beneath melting frost. But in the shadowed crevices and north-facing slopes, the cold lingered like an uninvited guest. Inside one such rocky alcove near the base of Pine Hollow Ridge, a new kind of warmth was slowly building, tentative, raw, and uncertain. Shadow had not left Bruno's side since the first night. He hadn't meant to name the cub, but as he whispered low rumbles to soothe him, the same syllables slipped from his breath, bruh, no, short, firm, protective. Bruno. The name stuck, as things often do when born from instinct. But bonding did not come easily. Bruno had grown stronger over the past days, but not more cooperative. He refused food unless starved and let out a pitiful squeal at any sound resembling larger animals. In the darkest hours, he paced the cave's narrow edge, sniffing the cold wind, eyes squinting toward the world beyond. Shadow, despite his patience, struggled to soothe the creature's longing. At night, Bruno whimpered in a rhythm that sounded too much like mourning. One morning, after returning with shredded venison wrapped in leaves, Shadow nudged the meat toward the cub. Bruno shoved it aside, retreating to a corner. The dog sat motionless for several moments, then quietly lay down with his back turned. It was not anger, it was space. He knew grief. It needed its silence. Bruno's hunger eventually overcame his sorrow. Hours later, Shadow pretended not to notice when the cub crept toward the meat and began to nibble. It was clumsy, more gnawing than chewing, but it was a beginning. 20 miles south, on the other side of the range, a mud-streaked Jeep Wrangler rolled slowly over uneven trails. Behind the wheel sat Dr. Avery Locke, 60 years old, shoulders square despite age, with a faded Marine Corps tattoo barely visible under the rolled sleeves of his checkered shirt. Avery had once been a field veterinarian in the military, deployments in arid deserts and jungle hellscapes, patching up both dogs and men. After retirement, he turned his attention to conservation biology, using his skills to understand the instinctual relationships between species in the wild. Most weeks, he lived out of his jeep and small base camp, preferring solitude over laboratories. His beard was iron-gray and neat, contrasting his weather-worn skin and alert blue eyes. Avery had seen war, both outside and within. His wife had died 10 years ago of pancreatic cancer, and his son, an army dog handler, hadn't come home from Kabul. Since then, Avery had walked away from cities, seeking answers in the wilderness where things either lived or didn't, without pretense. That morning, he'd been following a set of prints found near Glacier's eastern ridge, deep canine impressions matched by juvenile bear tracks. That combination was impossible. Predators of such different species did not move together. Not naturally. Not without interference. Yet the trail was real. And fresh. He knelt in the snow, brushing aside a sprig of pine. The paw prints were close, mere inches apart, and the depth suggested neither was being hunted. They were moving together. The prints wove between trees, circled once near a patch of frozen berries, then vanished toward a rocky incline. Avery rose, his heart beating slightly faster. "Now what the hell are you two doing?" he muttered to the wind. Back in the den, Shadow had begun training. Training a bear cub was not part of his military resume, but the principles held. Patience. Repetition. Reward. When Bruno growled in frustration trying to chew tough meat, Shadow would nudge a softer portion closer. When Bruno slipped on ice patches near the cave entrance, Shadow stood beside him and showed how to crouch low before stepping. When Bruno cried out at night for a mother who never came, Shadow pressed against him, warming him with his body heat, steady as stone. Each small victory was hard-won. Bruno bit Shadow once, out of fear, or frustration, or simple confusion. It left a mark just under the dog's jawline. Shadow did not retaliate. He simply turned away, offering space again. Bruno sulked for a day, but the next morning, curled beside Shadow's flank, he licked the wound once, quick, apologetic. They were learning each other's language. That week, something changed. Bruno had been struggling with a chunk of elk meat, whining as it slipped from his small jaws. Shadow stepped forward, expecting to offer help. But Bruno snarled, not with aggression, but with determination. He turned his head, gripped the meat again, and with a burst of resolve, tore a small strip free. It was messy, but it worked. Shadow stood still, tail low, watching. Bruno turned his head slowly, chewing, his dark eyes locking briefly with Shadow's. A flicker of understanding passed between them. Far above, on the western trail overlooking the forested basin, Mara Ellison crouched in her perch with binoculars. Through a narrow gap in the trees, she glimpsed movement, 4 legs, golden black fur, then the unmistakable dark shape of a bear cub beside it. She lowered the glasses slowly, her breath caught in her throat. It was real. Something no wildlife textbook had ever recorded. A lone German shepherd, living as a wild creature. And a black bear cub, traveling with it, not in fear, but in rhythm. She blinked, unsure if what she saw was miracle or madness. Mara reached for her radio, hesitated, then set it down. Some things, she thought, were not meant to be explained too soon. She simply watched. By late March, winter had begun to lose its grip on the valleys, though Glacier's higher ridges still wore thick caps of snow. Days grew longer, the air less sharp, and the streams, frozen for weeks, began to murmur with thawing life. Beneath the northern edge of Pine Hollow, where a fallen cedar leaned over a shallow ravine, Bruno and Shadow emerged each morning from their cave to a forest in flux. Shadow had become a teacher, not by choice, but by quiet necessity. His days now revolved around instruction, not survival alone. Bruno, growing stronger by the day, needed to learn more than how to feed. He needed to understand how to stay alive. Shadow began with sound. One crisp morning, they stood together in a clearing, still cloaked in snow but scattered with dry pine cones. Overhead, a great horned owl let out its low, haunting hoot. Bruno twitched, ears perking. Shadow remained still. When the second hoot came, Shadow dropped to his belly, pressing close to the ground. Bruno stared, confused. Shadow growled low, a single note. Wait. Then slowly, he rose and walked toward the brush, nudging a frozen branch aside to reveal the claw marks of a lynx, faint, but recent. The owl hadn't been calling for territory. It had been warning. Bruno didn't understand it all yet, but he followed. Every sound mattered in the wild. Every silence, too. Later that day, Shadow led him to a shallow brook newly freed of ice. Here, the old dog paused to sniff at a small pile of leaves beside a boulder. Then he lifted his leg and marked it with practiced precision. Bruno tilted his head, puzzled, then sniffed at the air. Shadow repeated the gesture, slower this time. The message was clear, this is ours. Bruno clumsily tried to imitate the motion, falling over sideways. Shadow didn't correct him, just waited until the cub got it right. Not far from the ravine, in a wide meadow dusted with melting snow, another presence stirred. Through the trees moved a shadow far older and heavier than the two companions. A female black bear, broad-shouldered, with fur matted from hibernation and weeks of desperate wandering, moved with anxious purpose. Her name would never be known to humans, but her story was clear to the forest. She had lost her only cub in a snowstorm, 3 ridges over. The trail had gone cold, then vanished completely. But she had not stopped searching. She had crossed rivers, climbed ridges she hadn't touched in years, and fought off coyotes who circled too close. Hunger hollowed her eyes, but instinct fueled her legs. She was thin now, and her paws cracked from ice, but she moved with the weight of something deeper than survival. And now, on the wind, something stirred her again. She paused beneath a fir tree, nose lifted. The scent, part familiar, part strange, hit her like lightning. Bear, but not only bear. Dog. And warmth. Something primal in her recognized a trace. Her cub. But altered. She grunted low and moved downhill. Shadow noticed the change before Bruno did. That afternoon, while Bruno tried climbing a low tree stump, his claws still clumsy on bark, Shadow froze mid-step. His nose twitched. Not fear. Not hunger. Something else. He growled low. Bruno, confused, dropped back to the ground, head cocked. Shadow scanned the tree line. Nothing visible. But the scent was there, deep and earthy. Another bear. Not Bruno. He nudged the cub with his shoulder, pushing him gently toward the cave. Bruno resisted at first, then obeyed when Shadow barked softly, once, twice. They retreated quickly, but not in panic. Shadow didn't show fear. Only caution. Inside the cave, Bruno curled up beside Shadow, watching his face. That night, Shadow didn't sleep. 3 days passed without another sign. The presence seemed to vanish like smoke. But Shadow remained watchful. He limited Bruno's range, kept him close, and took longer, wider loops when hunting. He didn't let the cub out of sight. Bruno, meanwhile, began to pick up more on his own. He noticed the difference between squirrel chatter and jaybird screeches. He learned to freeze when the wind shifted, nose to the air, just like Shadow. Once, when a mountain lion passed through the lower ridge, a lean male with golden eyes and a torn ear, Shadow led Bruno into a shallow crevice under a fallen log. They stayed still for nearly an hour. The lion never saw them. Afterward, Shadow showed Bruno a trick, how to growl not in threat, but in warning. Low and steady, enough to make smaller animals hesitate. Bruno tried, and the first time, his voice cracked. But by the third time, the sound came clearer, still young, but already effective. They were building a language. At the same time, Mara Ellison was narrowing in. She had returned to her cabin near Three Pines Creek, where she kept her field maps and journals. Her small home was modest, single-story, cedar walls, and a front porch littered with empty bird feeders and half-repaired snowshoes. Inside, papers covered her kitchen table, photos of tracks, field sketches, weather maps, and her own handwritten notes. She had contacted no one. Not yet. She knew the park biologists would descend like flies, wanting to trap, tag, separate. That wasn't what this was. What she was watching, if it was real, was not a science experiment. It was something sacred. So she tracked from afar. She hiked in silence, rode in silence, even spoke to herself in whispers. Each night, she lit a single candle on the porch and told her late partner, James, the day's events. "They're still together," she whispered one night, wrapping her old scarf tighter. "The little one's learning. It's not just survival anymore. It's trust. It's something bigger." On the fifth day, the mother bear appeared again. Shadow spotted her at sunset, standing across the ravine as the last light glowed against the melting snow. She did not growl. She did not charge. She simply stared. Bruno was inside the cave, chewing bark with mild boredom. Shadow stood at the mouth of the cave, tail low, ears alert. They watched each other for nearly a minute. Then the bear grunted once, deep and low, and turned away into the trees. Shadow waited another hour before he relaxed. Bruno didn't know how close the world had come to changing. The night fell sudden and hard. Clouds smothered the moonlight, turning Glacier's forest into a blur of black branches and whispering wind. The air, once mellowed by early spring, snapped again into frost. In a narrow corridor between two ridges, dense with tangled brush and uneven rocks, Bruno bounded clumsily after a half-eaten rabbit carcass, dragging it playfully through the snow. His growls were high-pitched, harmless, a cub's imitation of a predator. Shadow watched from a few paces behind, ears pricked, eyes narrow. He had allowed Bruno more space these past days, trusting in the lessons they'd practiced. But something in the air tonight unnerved him. The forest had fallen too quiet. Suddenly, a sharp crack of twigs echoed to their right. Shadow swung his head instantly. From behind a patch of snow-laced bushes, two wolves emerged, lean, gray, and hungry. Their ribs showed faintly beneath their matted coats, and their yellow eyes were locked on Bruno. Wolves rarely hunted bear cubs. But in early spring, hunger rewrites the rules. Bruno froze. His front paw dropped the rabbit. He gave a confused grunt, then stumbled back toward Shadow. The German shepherd stood tall now, placing himself between the wolves and the cub. He barked, a deep, resonant warning. But the wolves didn't flinch. They split apart, one circling left, the other right. Bruno let out a frightened squeal. Shadow launched forward. He met the wolf on the right first, jaws clamping down just below its ear. The two bodies collided with a thud into the snow. The second wolf lunged from behind. Shadow twisted in time to intercept with his shoulder, but its teeth caught the soft flesh behind his hind leg. He yelped, a sound he hadn't made in years, and his legs buckled slightly. Bruno, eyes wide and frozen, didn't run. He growled, then roared, a noise far louder than his body should have produced. It startled the wolf closest to him, giving Shadow the moment he needed. The old soldier's training took over. With a burst of strength, Shadow flung himself at the weaker wolf, forcing it to the ground. The second, sensing the change, backed away, snarling once before vanishing into the dark. Its partner followed seconds later, leaving two blood trails in the snow, and one far heavier than the others. Shadow staggered once. Then twice. He collapsed onto his side, breath ragged, a deep gash soaking through the fur on his back leg. Bruno crept forward, trembling. He nudged Shadow's shoulder, then licked the side of his muzzle. The old dog didn't move. Dawn broke slow and gray. Avery Locke, seated behind the wheel of his jeep near Timberline Ridge, stared through binoculars toward the distant valley floor. He had found the prints again the day before, clear canine tracks stained with specks of red. At first he feared it was a wolf bleeding. But the spacing, the structure, too uniform, too deliberate, suggested otherwise. He followed on foot for nearly 2 hours before finding it. A grove of spruce trees near the edge of a thawing stream held the scene, blood on fresh snow, drag marks, and then, silence. Avery crouched low beside the trail. He brushed a gloved hand along a paw print, noting its depth, the precision of the pads. His military training whispered the truth. German Shepherd, he murmured. Trained. Then he saw something that made him freeze, a second trail. Smaller paws. Wider toe spread. Bear cub. He raised his head slowly. Through the thinning pines, he spotted a depression in the snow beneath a rock overhang. There, curled around one another like a mismatched pair of puzzle pieces, lay the injured dog and the bear cub. Bruno looked up first. His fur bristled slightly, but there was no aggression, only wary caution. Avery stepped forward with care. He raised both hands and crouched low. "Hey there," he whispered, voice hoarse. "Easy." Shadow stirred. One eye opened, dull and heavy. His ears twitched. Then he recognized the scent, human, yes, but not unfamiliar. He had smelled this one before. Calm. Measured. Non-threatening. Avery studied the wound quickly, deep, but not fatal. Infection hadn't set in yet. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small metal flask, unscrewing the top to reveal an antiseptic wash. Shadow growled softly when the scent reached him, but didn't move as Avery dabbed the wound with a cloth. "You've done this before," Avery muttered. "Haven't you, soldier?" The dog's breathing was shallow but steady. Bruno moved closer, nuzzling against Shadow's chest. Avery sat back on his heels, staring at the pair. "I don't know what you two are," he said softly. "But I've seen brothers in combat with less loyalty than this." He didn't try to move them. Not yet. He returned to his jeep, grabbed a thermal blanket and a package of dried venison, and set both a few feet away from the cave. Then he left. That night, he made a fire beside the trailhead and scribbled notes into a weather-beaten field journal. Day 42. Subject A confirmed injured, likely from predatory encounter. Subject B exhibiting distress but not aggression. Mutual care behavior observed. Unprecedented. He paused, then added a second line. This is no longer observation. This is witnessing. 3 days passed. Shadow's wound began to scab. Bruno stayed close, refusing to stray far, even when hunger gnawed at him. Avery returned twice daily, never getting too close, but always leaving food and fresh water. He never brought a camera. He didn't want to document this. He wanted to protect it. The sun had begun to rise earlier over Glacier's forest, spilling golden streaks between the pine trunks and melting the stubborn patches of snow still clinging to the shaded earth. The air was different now, softer, more forgiving, and filled with the quiet murmur of spring's return. Sap began to flow again in the trees, and birds who had not sung for months added color to the silence. The forest was waking up. So too was Shadow. Though the gash on his leg still ached with each step, the swelling had gone down, and the limp, while noticeable, no longer slowed him to a crawl. His movements were careful, but not weak. Every night, Bruno curled tightly beside him, often waking to lick the wound with gentle persistence. Shadow tolerated it, even leaned into it on colder evenings. But something in the wind had changed. On the 4th morning since the attack, Shadow led Bruno to the stream for water. As they drank, he froze. His ears flicked, nose twitching sharply. Bruno mimicked him, lifting his head. From the south, a scent carried on the wind, strong, earthy, unmistakable. Bear. Adult. Female. And close. Shadow stepped in front of Bruno instinctively, lowering his body but keeping his head high. He didn't snarl. Didn't move. Just waited. The silence broke with the soft crunch of heavy paws against damp ground. A shape appeared between the trees. She came from the slope above the ravine, massive, solemn, worn by season and grief. Her fur was darker than Bruno's, with streaks of gray at her shoulders and around her eyes. Her ears were torn slightly at the tips, likely from battles past, and her eyes, sunken but alive, locked onto the pair by the stream. She did not roar. She did not rush. She stopped 20 feet away. Bruno tensed, uncertain. He glanced at Shadow. The old dog remained in position, tail still, shoulders taut. He looked not at the bear, but at Bruno. The cub took a cautious step forward. The mother bear, with a heavy sigh, dropped to all fours. She let out a low, breathy moan, a sound deeper than language. It was grief made audible. Bruno flinched. The sound awoke something ancient inside him. He stepped forward again, unsure, ears flicking. Then he stopped. Behind him, Shadow remained. That hesitation, the pause between instinct and loyalty, lasted only seconds, but it stretched the world thin. Then the mother bear moved again. She came slowly, head lowered, her body too tired for threat. When she reached within 5 feet of Bruno, she stopped. She sniffed the air, long, slow, deliberate. Her gaze swept across his body, down to his paws, up to his eyes. And then to Shadow. She saw him for the first time not as a threat, but as something else. She sniffed again, detecting a scent foreign, yet now embedded in her son. Something had been passed between them, milk, protection, trust. She growled once, not out of anger, but recognition. Bruno looked back at Shadow. The German shepherd stepped back slowly, giving space, eyes never leaving Bruno. He didn't retreat. He didn't submit. He simply waited. High on the ridge, hidden behind a downed cedar, Mara Ellison watched with her breath caught in her chest. She hadn't meant to be there at that hour, but a gut instinct, the kind she had followed for 30 years, had pulled her early from her cabin. Through her binoculars, she saw the full reunion unfold. Her hands shook. She whispered softly, "It's her, the mother." Her radio buzzed faintly, a check-in from park headquarters. She didn't answer. This moment wasn't to be shared yet. It wasn't science. It was soul. Meanwhile, Avery Locke stood half a mile down the trail, kneeling by the stream where blood had once stained the snow. He had returned to gather new readings, maybe even set up a motion camera, but something in the air changed. He looked up just in time to see a massive shape moving between the trees above. The bear. And with her, not far behind, Bruno. He reached for his binoculars, and then stopped. Bruno wasn't alone. Shadow walked beside him, not close, not possessively, but like a figure guarding from a distance. The dog limped, but his posture remained regal, even calm. The bear cub looked back at him every few steps. Then came the moment Avery would never forget. Bruno stopped halfway up the slope. The bear mother kept going. Bruno turned. He looked directly at Shadow. And he didn't move. Back in the clearing, Shadow stood at the base of a cedar tree, paws firm in the earth. His ears perked, tail low but steady. Bruno returned to him slowly. Pressed his nose gently to Shadow's shoulder. Then turned again, toward the bear. His two worlds stood in silence, waiting. Then the impossible happened. The bear approached both. She did not attack. She did not growl. Instead, she stepped close to Shadow. Sniffed him. And, after a moment, gently brushed her head along his flank. Shadow did not flinch. Some peace passed between them in that touch, a mother recognizing a guardian, a warrior acknowledging a loss. Then, quietly, the bear turned and began walking into the trees. Bruno hesitated only briefly. He looked back once more at Shadow, then followed. Shadow stood still until they vanished beyond the bend. That night, under a half-lit sky, Shadow returned alone to the cave. It was emptier now. Colder. But not desolate. He curled up in his usual spot, eyes half closed. Outside, the wind moved softly through the pines. He had done what he was meant to do. And somewhere deep in the wild, his student, his son, not by blood, but by bond, was home again. The forest was softer in the days that followed. April had arrived gently, wrapping the land in misty mornings and pale green shoots. Buds swelled on the branches of birch and aspen, and the high-pitched calls of migrating thrushes returned to the air like a long-forgotten melody. Life moved forward. Even in the spaces where grief once lingered, something new was stirring. Shadow had remained near the stream for 2 days after Bruno left. He didn't return to the cave immediately. Instead, he wandered along familiar paths, slowly, deliberately, his injured legs still stiff, though healing. He sniffed places where Bruno used to play, rested under the same tree where the cub had first climbed and tumbled, and paused at the edge of a clearing where they once chased deer together, not to hunt, but to learn. He was not searching. He was remembering. On the third morning, he returned to the cave. It smelled different now, emptier, colder, as if the walls themselves had exhaled a long-held breath. He circled the den once, then lay down in the corner where the moss was still pressed flat from the cub's weight. That night, he slept dreamlessly. For the first time in months, he didn't wake at every sound. Far across the forest, higher in the hills near Bear Spine Ridge, Bruno walked with his mother. She was strong again, her pace steady, her movements sure. Each morning, she foraged carefully, teaching him how to claw open rotten logs to find grubs, how to sniff out the sweet scent of early berries. She didn't coddle him, she didn't need to. Bruno was no ordinary cub. His body was thicker now, his shoulders broader, and though still clumsy at times, he carried himself with a strange mix of caution and calculation. He didn't roar at shadows or charge into clearings. He listened. He waited. He watched the wind. She noticed, too. Sometimes, when he paused mid-step to check the air, or tilted his head at the sound of birds going quiet, her eyes would narrow slightly. Not in distrust, but wonder. Her cub had learned something she hadn't taught. Bruno never tried to return to the cave. But sometimes, on still nights, he would sit at the edge of camp, gaze into the dark, and let out a low growl, not quite a bear's grunt, not quite a dog's bark. Something in between. She would listen in silence. Avery Locke had not stopped watching. Each week, he returned to the ridge above the den, noting that the dog had stayed alone. No sign of Bruno. He kept a respectful distance, no traps, no sedation darts, just pen, map, and eyes. He wasn't a scientist anymore, not really. He was a student. And the forest was the teacher. One afternoon, while checking a trail camera near the edge of a bluff, Avery met someone unexpected. A tall, wiry woman in her late 50s approached from the western trail. Her steps were quiet but firm, and her eyes, gray and sharp beneath the brim of a faded ranger's hat, held the kind of patience that came from years spent listening more than speaking. It was Sarah Whitlow, the park's former fire specialist, now retired. She had been living alone in a solar-powered cabin on the southern slope for almost a decade. Folks in the nearby town spoke of her with a mix of admiration and distance. She had fought wildfires in Oregon and Alaska, lost a brother to one in Wyoming, and after that, chose silence over society. Her face was weathered, lined from sun and smoke, but her movements remained agile. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and thoughtful. "I've been following the bear signs. Saw the cub. Saw the dog too, she said, glancing toward the valley. Didn't believe it until I saw it with my own eyes. Avery nodded. I've been tracking them for weeks. Sarah crouched beside the camera, checked the lens. What are you going to do with it? Avery shrugged. Nothing. She looked at him, surprised. Nothing? He met her gaze. Some stories aren't ours to publish. Sarah smiled faintly. Then we agree. They shared coffee from her thermos beneath a pine that had survived 3 lightning strikes. No more words were needed. Later that week, Shadow rose with the sun and limped toward the ridge where he had first taught Bruno how to mark a trail. The world had changed, but the forest knew him still. A raven followed overhead. A chipmunk chattered briefly and then disappeared. Everything moved aside as if acknowledging his passage. When he reached the overlook, he sat. Below, the river shimmered. Then he heard it, a rustling in the underbrush. He turned slowly, body tense but composed. From between 2 pines, a shape emerged. Bruno. Now larger, fur thicker, eyes darker, but unmistakably him. He didn't run forward. He approached carefully, respectfully, and stopped just in front of Shadow. For a moment, they just stood, 2 creatures from different worlds, shaped by opposite instincts, bonded by something deeper than nature. Bruno stepped closer and did something he hadn't done in weeks. He licked the side of Shadow's face. Not playful. Not needy. Gratitude. Then, without waiting for response, he turned and disappeared back into the trees. Shadow remained still. Not because he was stunned. But because he finally understood. He had been the bridge. And bridges are meant to be crossed. The mountains of Glacier had begun to wear green again. Snowmelt gushed down from high ridges, carving glittering paths through rock and moss, feeding the awakening roots below. 3 months had passed since Bruno disappeared back into the trees. Spring had laid its claim on the forest, softening the air, painting the hillsides with wildflowers, and calling every creature into motion. But one figure moved slower than most. Shadow. He was thinner now. The once powerful muscles beneath his sable coat had given way to lean lines and sunken ribs. His gait remained steady, but the limp in his hind leg had grown more pronounced with age and weather. Yet his eyes, those amber wells of quiet thought, had gained something they never had before, peace. He no longer searched. No longer waited. But every morning, he climbed the same trail, past the bent spruce and the fallen birch, to the ridge above the stream. And every evening, he returned, alone. Until the day he wasn't. Avery Locke had returned to the high trails, now in full bloom. His jacket, once lined with winter fleece, was tied at the waist, and the lines of his face were softened by sun. In his hands, he carried no instruments, no maps, only a leather notebook, half filled with sketches, field notes, and the untitled story he had begun to write in silence. He found Shadow right where he expected, at the ridge's crest, beneath a cedar newly adorned with green needles. The dog stood still, tail down, head high, staring into the tree line below. But today, his ears were alert. His body held a tension Avery hadn't seen in months. And then Avery heard it too. Not the rustle of wind or the murmur of water, but footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. From the brush emerged a figure Avery knew instantly. Bruno. No longer the cub with oversized paws and clumsy bounds, now a young bear, lean but powerful, with a coat darker than before and a chest broad from mountain climbs. His eyes still held that intelligent caution. And behind him, pacing with measured grace, came the mother bear, her scars faded, her body fuller, her movement regal. Avery stepped back instinctively, but Shadow didn't move. He simply watched. Bruno paused at the edge of the clearing. For a heartbeat, all was still. Then the bear did something unexpected. She lowered her massive head and stepped aside, giving Bruno room. And Bruno walked forward. He approached Shadow slowly, deliberately. Not as a cub to a parent, not as a bear to a dog, but as something in between. A son to his guardian. A traveler returned to the place where he had first become more than what he was born to be. Shadow remained still, eyes locked with Bruno's. Then, in a moment Avery would later write about as the turning point of his entire life, Bruno lowered his great head and pressed his nose once, gently, to the dog's cheek. Shadow responded with a single, slow wag of the tail. Behind them, the mother bear exhaled a deep breath, a sound of release, or understanding. She stepped forward, standing beside her son, yet did not intervene. The three stood there, silent beneath the cedar's watchful shade. On the opposite ridge, Mara Ellison sat cross-legged on a flat rock, binoculars lowered to her lap. She had stopped taking notes 2 weeks ago. Now she came only to see. To bear witness. She didn't smile often, but today a quiet smile touched the corners of her face. Her gray braid fluttered in the breeze, and for once, the ache in her joints didn't matter. She had seen fire consume entire forests. Now she saw something rarer, forgiveness. Later that afternoon, Shadow returned to the den with the bears in tow. The cave was smaller now, not in size, but in memory. Bruno stepped inside, sniffed the ground, paused at the nest of moss where he once slept beside the warmth of a protector not born of fur like his own. The mother bear didn't enter. She waited outside, near a sun-dappled boulder. Shadow sat at the cave's mouth, chest rising and falling slowly. Avery, still a few yards away, pulled a pencil from his pocket and began to write. He came back. Not out of need. But out of choice. The dog did not call. But he remembered. The mother did not fight. She understood. I have spent a life dissecting behavior. But this was no behavior. This was grace. When the sun began to set, Bruno and the mother bear rose. They turned without noise and began to move back into the woods. Bruno paused once. Looked back. Shadow gave no sign, but Bruno didn't need one. Somewhere, deep within the wild code of his body, he had learned that love does not cling, it releases. Avery remained behind with Shadow, sitting side by side on the overlook. The old dog leaned against his leg. Avery scratched behind his ear. Not bad, huh, he whispered. Shadow closed his eyes. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of thawing pine, the distant rush of river, and something else, something that had no scent but lived in the space between heartbeats. That night, Avery lit a fire beside his tent and opened his notebook. He titled the story he had waited months to name. The Silent Son of the Mountain. And beneath it, he wrote. It's not species that defines family. It's not blood, or instinct, or biology. It's the willingness to protect, the choice to stay, and the courage to let go. In the white stillness of winter, a miracle walked on 4 paws and found its way back through snow, memory, and time. Sometimes, the mountains do not echo your voice back. Sometimes, they answer with something better. The wild did not give them the same blood, the same voice, or the same path, yet they chose each other. And maybe that's the lesson for us too. In a world that often divides us by differences, perhaps the quietest love is the one that crosses lines we thought were unbreakable. So if this story touched something in you, share it with someone who believes in second chances. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments below, have you ever found family in the most unexpected place?